I'm here today with Burton Laine. Burton is the author of Arya The Protector. Arya the Protector is a charming and important story about fear and feeling protected. Using the example of Arya, a dog charged with guarding sheep, a grandfather teaches his grandson that much like Arya's sheep, we have nothing to fear because we're being protected by God. There are a lot of reasons for children to be fearful. The story about a protective sheepdog provides a message of hope. So the book is just beautiful. And as I was telling Bert earlier, I can't wait to read this to my grandkids. So Bert, thank you for writing this and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So maybe before we dive into the details of the book, maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about your background, where you live, and the other things that you've done.
Sure. Well, I live on the family farm in northern Minnesota, and it's a 100-year-old family farm. My grandfather settled here when he came here from Finland, and we have 3 generations that have lived our whole lives here. You know, I started doing photography when I was 16, so I have been doing 50 years of photography on this farm. And it's of the livestock and the work that we do as well as nature. And it's just really a joy at this part of my life to be able to, this part of my life to be able to share these things with other people. And the kinds of work that I've been doing most recently have been doing writing that relates to the farm.
Yeah, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about the other things that you've written in addition to this new book.
Well, I work as an editor of a magazine that's a mainstream magazine right now. It's mainly for seniors in our region. But in the past, I've done Christian writing books that have to do with youth work. One of them was a parent's guide that was teaching kids how to be leaders. Another one was a public relations manual for youth leaders. And then my wife and I, 20 years ago, worked with a day camp curriculum when we were working with a ministry with youth. The most recent book that I did was, before this one, was another book about our dog. It's called Holy Spirit Shepherd Dog. And most of the people that I talk to that are reading that one tell me they use it as a 30-day devotional. And I wrote it so it could be used that way, although a lot of people just read it straight through. But it has 30 short chapters, and it has photographs and Bible verses for each one of the chapters. But after I finished with that one, then God told me I'm supposed to do a children's book, and that sent me on a whole different direction. And I started thinking about how to handle that. And after thinking back about reading stories to my son when he was growing up, I finally decided that the way to start working on this children's book was to take each chapter from my other book and condense it into 2 or 3 sentences. And when I condensed that to 2 and 3 sentences, to starting putting photographs to it, then the story started coming together pretty well.
That's very cool. That's an interesting process, isn't it? And, you know, as I said, the book is just beautiful. And, you know, I can't wait for people to see it. But stepping back, how did you get started with sheep and the sheepdog?
That was kind of an interesting process. My wife and I have been married for 40 years. When she moved here on the farm with me, we both decided we didn't want cattle. She grew up on a dairy farm and she didn't want to go in that route, but we wanted to do something with farming. And when we eventually had kids, we wanted to be able to raise any children on the farm, and we eventually adopted a son. So we were able to do that. And at the time, I was working as a county agent. I was doing youth work with 4-H, and I was visiting a lot of farms. And I always noticed that when I went to a farm that had sheep, it was just very peaceful looking at the sheep out in a pastoral setting. And I started taking a look around here, and we have a hillside that we can see from our house. And I just started feeling like it would really be nice to have sheep up on that hillside. And that's a backwards way of looking at things, because I didn't think of all the work I was going to have to do otherwise with them, what I had to learn. But it all came into place. And we started looking for a particular breed of sheep that we thought would look nice on the hillside. And so that took a couple years, and we finally ended up with a breed that you would probably see in the Cheviot Highlands in Scotland. We just thought that would be fitting. And they're very hardy sheep. And we started with 2 bred ewes, and then we just started expanding from there. But my wife and I were both working away from home, and we knew we needed some help. And I started doing research on dogs. And as it happened, a friend of mine who had sheep nearby had just recently gotten a dog because he was losing lambs to coyotes, and he needed some help on his farm. So he got this dog to work as a sheepdog on his farm, and she ended up being pregnant. So she had puppies. And as a result, we ended up with one of those puppies, not really knowing that much about the breed. The breed of dog we have is Marama, and they aren't very common. They're mainly just bred to be raised with sheep and to work with sheep. And I'll tell you, God just blessed us. This breed of dog has worked so well for us over the years. We've had 4 of them now, and Arya has been the dog that we probably have been closest to over the years, and there is our most recent dog. And it just really is nice to be able to tell stories based on how she takes care of the sheep, because she teaches me something every day. That's one of the things about this breed of dog, is that we learn from them.
Wow, that's so cool. It must be wonderful to watch. How did you go about training your dogs?
Yeah, the easy answer is that the dog trains us. And that's really true. We've started out with puppies, and we've also started out with older dogs, depending on the time period that it happened. And with a puppy, I have a couple of photographs in the book of working with the puppy. And one of the things that we need to do is just develop a relationship. These are very loving dogs with the owners or with the farm shepherds. They don't really want to have too much to do with other people that come on the farm, but they are very loving with us. And we have to develop that relationship as right from the very beginning. And I have a photo in there of me walking the fence with a puppy. And from the time this puppy, in this particular case, was 2 months old until she was 8 months old, every night I went out and walked the fence of our pasture with her. And it became a relationship building, as well as a chance for the puppy to get to learn what her boundaries were. So she knew that this is her fence. This is where she's going to be living. And it's her job to keep the sheep inside, but it's also her job to protect the sheep from anything that is outside of the fence. And that's the way it works. And then as they get older, if you ever took a dog like this to dog training, the person who's doing dog training would just go crazy, because they just do not respond like a dog normally does if you take them in that kind of a situation. These dogs, just by instinct, know how to take care of the sheep. And they each do it a little bit differently. However, they do it very similarly. And we just have to pay attention to how they're taking care of the sheep, and then adapt our methods to work with the dog. And that works.
And so how do they actually take care of the sheep?
Well, there's a lot of different things that they do. And, I've learned, for instance, that they have 3 different kinds of barks. They have an alert bark, which when the dog just thinks there's something going on in the neighborhood and they want us to know and be aware there's something going on, the dog will do an alert bark, and the sheep will just keep grazing. And then they have a warning bark. And if there's a warning bark, then the sheep usually just look up and they'll look around, but they don't do anything much. They look around and then they'll go back to grazing again. And she does the warning bark when she thinks there might be something getting close. And then she has an alarm bark. And the alarm bark works a couple different ways. Now we have our sheep in the barn at night. And we've just chosen to do that over the years. Not all farms do that, but we do. And when we have an alarm, or when the dog does an alarm bark, if she's out in the pasture with the sheep, then she takes off for the barn and the sheep follow her. And she'll go to the door of the barn and stand by the door of the barn. The sheep will run in the barn and then she stands by the door.
Wow.
And if they're closer to the barn and she does the alarm bark, she just stands by the door and barks and they run in.
Huh. Goodness sakes.
And, one of the other things about the dog is that this breed of dog keeps the sheep calm. And she keeps everything peaceful around the farm. And I can give you an example. When there was one year where we had a dog that died in the spring, and this was before the internet. If you can imagine, before the internet, as we're so tied to it these days. But I had a very difficult time finding another dog, so we went without a dog all summer. Now, typically when the sheep are out grazing in the field, what they do is we let them out of the barn, they go out and they graze in the morning, and then they lay down in the field and the dog stays out there with them and they rest, and then they basically spend the whole day out in the field. The summer when we did not have a dog, the sheep would go out and graze in the field in the morning, and then they would go in the barn. And they would lay in the barn for a part of the day, and then they would go back out in the field again. We finally found a dog in Kentucky, and I drove to Chicago. The owner of the dog met us in Chicago. She had a sheep farm and she was getting rid of her sheep, and she figured out she couldn't have the dog without sheep. So it worked out just perfectly for us to be able to bring this dog onto our farm. So that evening, I had the dog in the barn with the sheep. And then the next morning we opened up the door and the sheep and the dog went out in the field and the sheep were grazing. And when they got done grazing, they laid down in the field because they were feeling protected. And they knew that this dog immediately took on that role.
Wow.
So they were comfortable to stay out in the field again.
That's just amazing. And so regardless of which dog you've had, they've still kind of had that same types of barks?
Yes, yeah, they do, and they probably communicate with the sheep in other ways too. But those are the three main barks that I've noticed over the years. Yeah.
Wow. And roughly how many sheep are we talking about?
Well, we've had a large number at times. Large for us. This is a 40-acre farm, so it's not very large. Actually, it's kind of amazing. My grandfather and my dad were able to make their living off of this farm until about the 1960s. And, nowadays you can't do that. But there have been times when we've had as many as 50 sheep on the field in the summer. Now we only winter about a dozen at this stage of life. And, so we can have up to maybe 25 in the summer.
Okay. And is there like any difference between how the dogs relate to, adult sheep versus young lambs?
There is. It's kind of interesting because Arya kind of gets excited every spring when the lambs are being born. And what happens with lambs is when the sheep will have their lambs in the barn, and then they're in a pen in the barn for 3 days before we put them out. And every night when Arya comes in the barn, the way we work with our sheep is that the sheep are in the barn overnight. And then Arya comes in and she has her own separate part of the barn that she goes into so she can be off duty for a while. And then she has to be working all day. And, for a lot of sheep farms, they have their sheep out all the time, and the dogs mainly are working at night because that's when the predators are out. So they don't get a lot of rest. And I don't know how it worked in biblical times, because you think about the shepherds being out with sheep. They didn't have any barns to put their sheep into. So they were out with them all the time. So for them, they had to have a discernment about when there was danger around so they could get some sleep, while they were with the sheep. But that's how the dogs are too. And with our dog in the barn, when Arya goes in at night, she always goes and checks the pens to see the new lambs. And then what happens after 3 days is that we turn out the mother and the lamb with the rest of the sheep, and we'll have them in the barn for a little while by themselves to make sure that the lamb follows the ewe, because that's an important behavior, so she stays safe. And then when we put them outside, then it's just a ruckus, because all of the other sheep that are outside want to come and see the new lamb, and the new lambs want to come and see the new lamb. So it's very noisy. And the mother gets a little bit intimidated by all of these other sheep coming around her, even though she lives with them all the time. And what happens when it gets noisy is Arya, we kind of call her a manners minder, because she doesn't like it when anything gets out of control. And if it gets noisy like that, she'll go and she'll walk through all of the sheep very calmly, and it just calms the sheep. So then after that happens, then all the lambs just go off by themselves, and the sheep go and graze, and everything's fine. But Arya takes that kind of a role. And then when the sheep get a little bit older, they'll start playing, and we have a barrel out in the pasture, and they'll jump up on the barrel, and they'll get together and run through the field together. And the ewes actually depend on Arya to watch them, to watch the lambs while they're grazing. So Arya will do that. But, there's another part of it too, is that Arya knows that the lambs need to get to know her, and she's really very gentle with them. And when she's out in the pasture, she'll just be laying down, and the lambs will come over and they'll paw at her and they'll sniff her, and she just lets them do that. It doesn't bother her at all. And she knows that that's important to building that relationship, because as they get older, they have to be able to depend on her.
I mean, it so much reminds me of the movie A Dog's Purpose,
Oh, yeah.
It's really clear that Arya has a purpose, and she understands it quite well.
Well, she does. And, I talk about the fence. And there's one photograph in the children's book of her standing on a snowbank, and the fence is like an inch off the top of the snowbank. So obviously she could jump over the fence, and she could get out of the fence area. And she is so dedicated to this, she never just is there inside the fence, no matter what the situation is.
So you mentioned in the book also that, Arya kind of watched over you. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, as the farm shepherd, we really do develop a unique relationship, and I'm sure anybody that works with a working dog can talk about that. But the first time I noticed this, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. My wife likes to do arrangements on our deck for Christmas. She'll use containers, and she'll put greens and a number of different types of branches in there, and then she puts lights on them. And we have to gather those greens and those types of tree branches. And there was one winter where I went out in part of our wooded area on the farm, and I gathered some birch tree branches, and I was just thinning out an area where they were too close together, and I was dragging those across the field. I probably was going through 8 inches of snow, and I was on the outside of the pasture. And when I got to the top of the hill, Arya came running up to the top of the hill. Now, usually when she comes up to the hill, she comes to the fence and wants me to pet her. But this particular time was interesting, because she got about 10 feet away from the fence, and she turned around and she sat down, and she just was watchful. And she was watching over the sheep, but she was also like she was in a position of protecting me. And that was the first time that I noticed it happen. And from that time on, whenever I was outside working in the farmyard, she would position herself so she's watching me as well as watching the sheep.
Wow.
And another part of that too is, like I say, we have this relationship that we build over time, and I have one photo in there of me sitting out in the pasture, and I've had a couple of family members died where it was really a very it was a difficult time period. And when that kind of thing happens, I go out and I sit with the sheep in the barn, out in the pasture. And I used to sit on a rock when I was younger, but now I take a three-legged stool and I go out and I'll sit in the pasture and I'll just spend time with the sheep. And when I sit down out there, pretty soon there's a nose that comes from behind and goes in between my arm and my body, and she just sticks her head right in between there and comes next to me and sits down and really comforts me. And she'll sit with me as long as I'm out there. And it's just one of those things where I just feel like that kind of a relationship develops over time, but it's just a kind of a special time when that happens.
The ability for dogs to sense different things like that is just amazing.
Yeah.
But it's real, and I think most of us that have had long period relationships with dogs realize that.
Right.
Their sense of relating to humans and being able to sense things that we can't even is just astounding.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you writing this book. And I know that so many people, kids and grown-ups alike, are going to enjoy this. So thanks for blessing us all with that, Bert.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I've run test trials with a number of different people with it. And, it's just been fun to hear the stories about, parents reading it to their children, as well as the children taking over and reading it themselves and identifying the sheep and identifying the dog as they're reading it. I hope it'll help, because I really understand that during this time period, I think a lot of kids are experiencing fear and anxiety. And, their lives have been turned upside down. They can't go to school. They can't get together with their friends. They can't have birthday parties. It's just a time period where I think they need to be comforted. And if they can read this book or have somebody read it to them and understand that God's there to watch over them and protect them, then it's all worth it.
I think so too. And, it's hard for younger kids to really have any understanding of what's going on, and why the world has changed so much as it has. And I agree with you that, they have to be fearful. There's no other way, for them to respond. And
yeah.
So hopefully your book will be that. Will be a comfort for many children.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again, Bart. And, we'll look forward to sharing this with more folks.
Okay. Thank you much.